Hi, welcome back. In today's video, we will see more about HTTP connectors. We already have a demo project created. This is a Hello World project that we have created in last session. We have HTTP listener where global elements represents the configuration information of HTTP listener. And here we can see that the listener is listening to localhost 8081. And configuration XML file will have the information of the flows. So any changes that you do for the component here in the XML will reflect in the flow as well. So if we change the document name, it will reflect in the flow. So this is a transfer message where we are building the output payload, and we have a listener, and the response tab here will have the information of the responses that we are giving to the user. It can be success response or the error response. So in case of error, we give errors, and also for success, we build a payload and give it to the user. So this is the HTTP request that listener is listening to, and we are getting a success response, hello world response back. So let's try to give some input in JSON format. Let's add some test message. Here we can see that in the console we have an input message logged. So listener is listening to the request, and the logger is printing the payload, input payload, and transformer is where we are building the output payload, which we are getting as a response. So this is about HTTP listener, and HTTP request is one of the most widely used HTTP component. So let's try to use HTTP request and try to call an API. So let's remove the transfer message. So we will use HTTP request to make a call to the REST API or the SOAP API. So let's try to add some display name for the component. So we need some REST API or SOAP API example. So this is the API that I got online. So let's try to call the same API by using HTTP request component. So I have copied the link and trying to call this API from Postman. So this is host. We have path. We also have list of query parameters, and also we are getting success response. So let's try to call this API from HTTP request. So to call an API, we have to give the information of the request that we are making. So let's try to click on the configuration and give the information of the API. Let's add the host. We don't have any specific port, so let's leave it default one. And we have path information, so let's add path information. It's a get API. We have query parameters, right? We don't have any request body. It's a get API, so let's remove the input body, request body. Let's try to add the query parameters. We have amount. For now, let's hard code some value to the input request parameters. So we have one more query parameter, category, and let's try to hard code some value for now. So we have given the information of the API. We have given host, get is the HTTP method, we have given path, and we get a payload as a response. So in the output, we get a payload. So we are not saving the payload in any target variable. So payload is what we get after processing the message. So let's try to print the payload as it is. So the application is deployed now, and let's go to the localhost HTTP call. We are getting a connectivity error. Let's try to see if we have any configuration issues, and it's failing to connect to this HTTP request. So let's check the configuration again. Here we can see that we have extra slash when we have defined the request information. So we don't have to give a slash when defining host. So let's remove it. So now we have the configuration information defined properly. So let's try to deploy the application again. And now it's a connectivity issue. It's a connection timeout. So this is the random API that I got online. So sometimes it gives connectivity or timeout exceptions. So let's try to call the real API. Even this is taking time. So that's the reason we are getting connection timeout error. So let's try to call it multiple times. We should be able to get the response this time. Yes, now we got the success response. This is the response that we are getting from the API. Right? We are getting 200 success response, and this is the response that we got by calling the API by using request HTTP request component. So at the end we are printing the response that we are getting from the API. So we have input payload and output payload. So let's try to do some mapping and combine both input payload and output payload. So let's see how to do the mapping, some simple mapping here. So we are getting the payload. After processing the request, we are getting the output. So let's try to save the output in a target variable. Let's say we are saving the response in a variable. So let's try to concatenate the input payload with the response that we are getting from API. So API response is the response that we are getting from the API call. So let's do this simple response mapping. Let's concatenate the input payload and also the output from the API. So now we can see that we are adding the input payload with the output payload. So we are seeing the input message in the output response as well. Let's try to customize the message, test message. We should be able to see the different message now in the success response. Yes, we can see the custom message and also the response from the API. So we did concatenate both the input payload and also the payload that we are getting from the API call. Yes, we have used HTTP listener component and also the HTTP request. So we were getting the response in JSON. So let's try to get the response in XML. This time we will get an error because while trying to give the response in XML, we should give the root element as well. So without that, it will give an exception. So while writing the response in XML format, we have to add some root element as well. So let's try to change the mapping and try to get the response now. Yes, now we are getting the response in XML. So root element we have added and also the response that we had in JSON. So now it's coming as a XML in XML format. Yes, we have used listener, HTTP request, and we got the response in JSON as well and also in XML format. So previously we did hard code the values, the query parameters, right? So let's try to read these as input parameters. So let's see how to read and use it while calling a different API from HTTP request component. Let's try to pass the input as a query parameters so that HTTP listener will listen to these requests. So we will get input payload, URI parameters, and also query parameters, so on. So attributes will have query parameters information. So let's try to use the query parameters from attributes.queryparams. The name of the query parameter. This is how we can access the input parameters. So amount and category that we are passing as a query parameter. So we are accessing them through attributes.queryparams. Yeah, now let's try to deploy it again and try to run the API. It's taking more time. I think we will get a connectivity error this time as well. So it's because it's a random API that I got, so it's giving connectivity issue sometimes. Yes, it's a connection timeout exception. So the real API also is taking more time, so there are connection issues. So let's go to the API and call again. Let's try to remove the query parameters and see what we get. We are getting success response. Response code is 2. Let's try to add the query parameters, and we are not getting the response as expected. It's 200, but the response is not as expected. Let's see if we are passing the input properly. Okay, for category we are passing amount, and for amount it's category. So let's change it properly. The amount input, we should pass it to amount parameter properly. Same for category as well. So yeah, now we are reading the proper query parameters and calling the API. So let's try to deploy again. It's taking time, so I think we will get connectivity error again. So let's wait for some time and call again. So this time we are passing the amount and category as a request parameter and using the same to call the API. So we got the connectivity error, and now we are getting the success response, right, as expected. So we passed the query parameter as input and using the same to call the API. So we are accessing the query parameters through attributes and using them to call the API, right? So let's try to get one more REST API and call it from the application just by using HTTP request component. So this is one of the API that is available online. So let's use the same and call this from HTTP request component. So let's search for request and add the configuration, and here we can define the information of host, port, and other information related to the API. So host, and we don't have any specific port, so let's click on OK. It's a HTTP call. you can select HTTPS based on your requirement. So let's copy the API and call the API from Postman. So we are getting success response, right? So this is the API. So let's copy the host, path and other information here and define the configuration for HTTP request. So host, it's HTTPS and get HTTP method, right? And this is the path. So let's add the path information. We don't need the request body, it's a get API. So we have defined the API information and let's use transform message to get the response back. So after processing the request, we get the payload as output. So let's print the payload and give the payload as an output to the user. So we are calling an API and getting the payload. So output payload and giving the user the payload as it is. So let's call the API. Yeah, we are getting the success response. So this is as expected. We are calling a board API, so that will give us the response. So every time you call the API, you get a different activity and different type of activity you get and different description for the activity you will get. So let's try to call the API multiple times and see if you are getting the response as expected. So I think now, yes, we are getting the success response. So we have called multiple APIs, right? We have multiple API calls in one flow, right? So let's try to do some mapping. If we just want to get the activity, so you can do the mapping here. It's a simple mapping, just payload.activity, that will just give you the activity each time. Now we should be able to get just the activity, right? So we still have connectivity issue because we have multiple API calls. So if one is not able to connect, we get error. So now if you see, each time we get different activity, right? So this is the response that we are getting from the the latest API call that we have, right? So we are building the output payload where we are just getting the activity and giving it to user. So this is how you can just use the HTTP request component and call the API. So we just have to give the configuration information, host, port, and what type of HTTP method, whether we have request body, headers, URI parameters, query parameters, so on. So once we give all the information, so and if you are able to connect to the host and call the API, we will get the output, we get the response, the output payload. You can save the output in a target variable and use it in the mapping. So otherwise by default it will be a payload. So we have used a target variable and saved the response, and after that we are calling one more API and getting the response, and we are building the output payload just by getting the activity, right? We are just getting the activity from the payload and giving it to the user. So we have seen how to use HTTP listener component and HTTP request components. So listener component is to listen the HTTP request, and we use HTTP request component to call the APIs, just that we have to give the information of the APIs, what is host, port, and the parameters that are required to call the API. So and we got the response, and also we did a mapping, and for now the latest payload is giving the activity information to the user. So we can always do the mapping and give the user what they needed, right? So for now everything is in one flow. One demo flow has multiple request calls and the mapping information, right? But in reality we will create subflows and create discrete flows and keep the flows segregated and all that we can see in the future session. But for now, let's find out one more API. And yeah, now we are just getting the activity information, right? Always we are getting success response, so we are not getting any errors or something. But let's try to see how to consider a failure as a success. So for example, if we get some error, unprocessable entity or something, let's see how to consider it as a success. So this is one more example of an API. So we are getting the response based on the name that we are giving, right? This is one of the API that we are going to call again. So if we pass the name as an input, we should be able to get the response from the new API. So let's try to call this API again from our test flow. So this is the host information. So I have removed all the previous requests because sometimes we used to face connectivity issues, right? So I have removed all of them. So let's try to call the API newly. So host is given. So let's try to give the path as well. It's HTTPS and HTTP method is get. We don't have any HTTP body headers or anything, but we have a query parameters called name. Let's try to read the name information from the query params. Attributes dot query params, and name is the variable name for the query parameter, right? At the end, we just give the payload as it is to the user. So we haven't given any path. Okay, that's it. We just have the host and a name as a query parameter, right? Now we are getting, sorry, this is the real API. So yeah, now we are getting the success response. This is working as expected, right? What if we don't pass the name? So we still get the 200. But for name there is no response, but still we are getting 200. So let's remove the parameter. Let's don't give the name itself. So let's wait for the deployment. So now we are getting 500, right? So the error is, while calling the API, we are getting unprocessable entity. 422 we are getting. So let's call the real API and see what we get. We get 422 unprocessable entity, where the error is saying missing name parameter, right? We are not giving the name parameter, so we are getting 422. So let's say if we want to handle this 422 as a success, right? Sometimes you get a situation where you want to handle 500 and other errors as a success. In that case, you can always go to response tab and give the response validator information. Success status code validator. So this way you can consider 200 and 422 both as success. So again we are giving the payload to the user. Let's see what we will get. So now we are getting 200 as a response, right? Because see, we are getting a 200 as a response code, but if you see the message, it's saying missing name parameter. It was 422, right? It was 422 unprocessable entity because the name parameter is not given. But now we have considered that as a success flow, right? In our flow, we considered this 422 as a success response because we did validate the success response codes where we are saying both 200 and 422 should be considered as success. So this way you can always control what error code you want to consider as success or failure. you can always go to response tab and use this response validator. For example, if you want to consider 204 as a failure, you can do it. You can always control here the response codes. So this way we can use HTTP request components and call the API, get the response and save the response in a target variable, or control the response codes. Whether you want to consider a particular response code as a success or failure, you can always do that in the response tab. So yeah, you can pass header parameters, query parameters, or request body, so based on your requirement. And after processing the message, you get a output as a payload, and you can always save the payload in a target variable. Yeah, that's it for today. Thank you. See you in next session.